Have you ever been underestimated, judged by the way you look or by your age? Or maybe you've experienced a moment when someone looked down on you, only to realize later just how wrong they were. Now, imagine that someone looked at you and assumed you had nothing of value, no importance, no influence, nothing that could surprise them. How would you respond? This is the story of one woman who was dismissed, ignored, and treated unfairly. She walked into a bank like any regular customer. She didn't wear a suit, didn't carry a designer bag, and perhaps she looked like just another elderly woman to the people around her. But what unfolded next would not only stun the banker who insulted her, but would also send a message that still echoes today. Never judge a book by its cover. Why should you keep watching? Because this isn't just a story of one woman proving her worth. It's a lesson in humility, a reminder that wealth, wisdom, and influence don't always look the way we expect. And by the end of this video, you'll understand just how dangerous it is to make assumptions about others based on appearances alone. So, who was this woman? And why did she visit the bank that day? Why did the banker look at her and assume she was insignificant? And what did she say or do that left him absolutely speechless? Stay with us as we reveal each part of this story, layer by layer. It's a tale of quiet dignity and power. And by the end, you might just see the world and the people around you a little differently. It was a typical day at one of the city's most prestigious banks. A quiet hum filled the air as bankers typed away on their computers. Clients murmured softly, and the polished marble floors reflected the calm professionalism of the space. The bankers wore crisp suits, their ties neatly knotted, shoes shining, each one carefully groomed to project the bank's image of success, sophistication, and authority. Then the doors swung open, and in walked an elderly black woman. She was dressed simply, with clothes that looked comfortable but far from luxurious. Her hair was pulled back, and she held a worn leather handbag, the kind that had seen years of use. She didn't have the polished look that usually commanded attention in this bank. She didn't wear jewelry that sparkled under the bank's bright lights, nor did she carry a designer purse. Just a simple, quiet woman who carried herself with a kind of dignity that might have gone unnoticed by most. But the banker who first noticed her wasn't interested in dignity. He gave her a quick glance, just a brief moment to take her in. And in that instant, he made up his mind about her. To him, she looked out of place. Someone who didn't belong in a bank where millionaires and business tycoons walked through the doors daily. Maybe she was lost. Maybe she was here to make a small withdrawal or to get some advice on a minor account issue. Whatever the case, he didn't see her as someone worth his full attention. As she approached his desk, he raised an eyebrow, barely masking his surprise. He glanced back at his screen, pretending to be busy, thinking she'd perhaps go away. But she didn't. She stood there patiently, waiting. Finally, after a few awkward seconds, he looked up again, reluctantly, his expression one of slight irritation mixed with condescension. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone flat and uninterested. He didn't even try to hide the fact that he didn't expect this woman to be an important client. The woman nodded politely, her voice calm and steady. "Yes, I'd like to discuss my investments." The banker raised his eyebrows, the hint of a smirk playing on his lips. Investments. He almost chuckled. Was she serious? To him, this woman didn't look like she had any significant investments. The clients he dealt with wore tailored suits and designer watches, and they certainly didn't walk in without an appointment, asking for advice without a personal banker in tow. She didn't fit the profile. Still, he forced a tight smile and said, "Do you have an account here, ma'am?" As though expecting her to be in the wrong place. His tone was polite but cold, like he was barely able to mask his disbelief. He assumed this would be over in seconds. She'd realize she was out of her depth and leave quietly, saving both of them time. But that wasn't what happened. The woman looked him straight in the eye and responded, "Yes, I've been a client here for many years." A slight wave of confusion crossed his face, but he kept his professional mask on. barely letting it show. Years? He had no memory of her. In his mind, he would have remembered if this woman had a significant account. But he gave her a curt nod and decided to humor her, though he clearly still wasn't taking her seriously. "All right," he said. "Do you happen to know your account number?" The woman opened her worn leather handbag and pulled out a small, neat envelope. Inside was a list of her account details, something she'd obviously prepared in advance. Her fingers were steady, and she handed it to him with the kind of quiet confidence that should have given him pause. But he didn't notice. He took the paper, his eyes barely glancing over it, assuming it would reveal a small checking account, maybe a few savings. But as he looked at the numbers, his smirk faded. His face shifted, just slightly, but enough for the woman to notice. His hands froze for a moment, and he blinked, reading the numbers again, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. This was no ordinary account. The amount was substantial. In fact, it was more than most clients he dealt with had. And here was this elderly woman, standing quietly, not a hint of boastfulness in her expression, just waiting for him to catch up with the reality that was right in front of him. The banker looked up at her, and for the first time, he didn't see just an old woman in simple clothes. There was a glimmer of something else, respect, perhaps, or maybe just shock. He didn't say anything at first, but he cleared his throat, realizing he'd severely underestimated the person standing before him. This wasn't just any client. She was one of the bank's largest investors, a woman who held more influence in this place than he could have ever imagined. But she didn't flaunt it. She didn't scold him or point out his mistake. She simply waited, letting the weight of her quiet power fill the space between them. And for the first time, the banker realized he was in the presence of someone extraordinary, someone he'd misjudged entirely. The banker sat there, his polished appearance a testament to his sense of self-importance. To him, appearances spoke volumes. He'd spent years perfecting his image, from the fine cut of his suit to the glimmer of his watch. Every detail, every polished piece of himself was carefully crafted to convey his authority, his confidence, and, in his mind, his superiority. He was used to people coming to him with respect, maybe even a hint of awe, as they sought his advice on their finances. But this woman, this elderly black woman standing calmly in front of him, she wasn't fazed by his carefully curated presence. Her face remained composed, polite, even as his gaze lingered on her a little too long, the faintest hint of disdain in his eyes. He didn't realize it, but he was giving himself away. To her, it was clear as day. He thought he was above her. He had made his judgment in a single glance, convinced he knew everything he needed to know about her just by the way she looked. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" he asked, his tone filled with an almost patronizing politeness. The words were gentle on the surface, but beneath them lay a cutting assumption that she didn't belong here, not in this bank, not in this space of wealth and privilege. The woman looked at him, unflinching, her face betraying none of the irritation or offense she might have felt. Her gaze remained steady, almost piercing, but the banker missed it. His mind was too clouded by his assumptions to pick up on the calm strength in her eyes. He saw only what he expected to see, a woman who looked too ordinary, too unimportant to be here. "Do you have an appointment?" he continued, his voice still laced with a polite coldness. "Or perhaps you'd like to speak to one of our customer service representatives." The unspoken message in his words was clear. He believed she was here to handle something minor, something that didn't require the attention of a banker of his status. But the woman didn't flinch. She didn't apologize or back down. She simply shook her head and replied in her quiet, calm voice, "I'm here to discuss my investments. I think you'll want to help me." Her words took him aback, but only for a second. He hid his surprise behind a thin smile, one that bordered on condescension. Investments, he thought to himself. This woman. She wanted to discuss investments with him, one of the bank's most senior advisors. He fought the urge to chuckle. In his mind, there was no way this woman had any significant investments to speak of. He imagined a small account, maybe a few $100s saved up from years of careful budgeting. Certainly nothing that warranted his expertise. "Well, ma'am," he said, trying to keep his voice steady and professional, "investment portfolios are generally handled by our wealth management team. But if you'd like, I can take a look." His words were meant to sound helpful, but the patronizing edge was unmistakable. He was doing her a favor, in his mind, indulging her request, as though it were a mere whim. The woman handed over her paperwork without a word. Her movements were smooth, her gaze steady as she watched him take the envelope from her hand. For a moment, he hesitated, almost as if some instinct was warning him to tread carefully. But he brushed it off, too caught up in his assumptions to pay any attention to the feeling in the back of his mind. As he unfolded the papers, he glanced at them quickly, expecting the numbers to confirm his assumptions. But as his eyes moved over the figures, his smirk faded, his brow furrowed, and a flicker of confusion crossed his face. He blinked, rereading the numbers, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This wasn't just a small account. It wasn't even a moderate portfolio. It was enormous, one of the largest he'd seen in recent months. In fact, her holdings were substantial enough to make her one of the bank's top clients. The realization hit him like a shockwave, but he fought to keep his expression neutral, unwilling to let her see the impact her account details had made on him. For the first time, he looked at her, really looked at her. This wasn't just an ordinary woman standing before him. She was, in fact, one of the bank's most important clients, and he had just treated her like she didn't matter, like she was wasting his time. He felt a flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck, but he forced himself to stay composed, to keep the professional facade that was now slipping through his fingers. But the woman had noticed. She could see the shift in his demeanor, the subtle change in his posture, and the way he was suddenly avoiding her gaze. She didn't need to say a word. The silence was enough. The power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely, but she hadn't had to raise her voice or insist on her importance. Her wealth, her investments, they spoke for her in a way that cut through his prejudice far more effectively than any words could have. The banker cleared his throat, struggling to regain his composure. I see," he stammered, trying to mask the unease in his voice. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention." But the usual confidence in his tone was gone. He felt exposed, embarrassed, like he had just been caught in a lie. Yet, even in this moment, the woman didn't mock him or call him out. She didn't need to. Her quiet dignity did all the talking. She simply nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth, as though she understood exactly what was going through his mind, and knew that no scolding she could give him would be as powerful as the realization he was coming to on his own. The banker, now thoroughly uncomfortable, glanced down at the papers in front of him. His usual confidence was slipping, and he could feel beads of sweat starting to form under his collar. He tried to mask his discomfort, but there was no denying it. He was out of his depth, caught completely off guard by the client in front of him. Yet, the elderly woman remained calm, as though she hadn't even noticed the shock he was struggling to hide. She didn't gloat or raise her voice. Instead, she stood there quietly, her hands resting on her worn leather handbag, waiting patiently as though nothing unusual had happened. Her calmness was almost unnerving, like she had all the time in the world and nothing to prove. The banker cleared his throat, attempting to reassert himself. After all, he was the professional here, wasn't he? The expert, the one people came to for advice and guidance. But the numbers in front of him told a different story. They whispered to him that this woman's financial knowledge likely ran deeper than he could have imagined. And yet, he was still struggling to accept it. Trying to regain his composure, he looked up at her and forced a polite smile. "Ma'am, thank you for bringing this information. I can certainly help you with your investments," he managed to say, though his voice lacked its usual assurance. The woman nodded slightly, acknowledging his words, but instead of responding with gratitude or eagerness, she simply said, I would appreciate if you took this matter seriously. Her tone was soft but firm, a quiet reminder that this was no trivial request. She wasn't here to seek approval or to be treated as a charity case. She was here to do business, plain and simple. The banker felt a small sting of embarrassment at her words. Took this matter seriously. Of course he was taking it seriously. Now anyway. But he couldn't deny the truth behind her statement. He had dismissed her without a second thought, treating her as though she was out of place in his office. And she knew it. She'd seen right through him. And now, with that simple, firm reminder, she was letting him know that she hadn't missed a thing. Of course, ma'am, he replied, attempting to mask his discomfort with professionalism. He glanced back at her account details, searching for something, anything, that might give him a sense of control. But all he found were the numbers staring back at him, numbers that clearly demonstrated this woman's significant wealth. And yet, her presence was completely unassuming. She didn't look like the wealthy clients he was used to dealing with. She had none of the airs of importance, none of the haughty expressions or grand gestures. She was entirely different, which was exactly why he'd misjudged her in the first place. The tension in the room began to mount. He could feel it like a weight pressing down on his shoulders, a reminder of his mistake hanging thick in the air. The woman, however, remained calm, letting him squirm under the realization of his own prejudice. The banker hesitated, then decided to proceed cautiously. Perhaps, ma'am, he ventured, you'd like me to go over a few options for your portfolio, strategies we could consider. But the woman simply shook her head, her gaze steady and unwavering. I already have a strategy in mind, she said, her voice as calm as ever. Her words caught him off guard once more. Clients rarely came in with their own strategies. They usually deferred to him, asking for his advice, relying on his expertise. But here she was, confident, composed, and absolutely clear about what she wanted. He felt the ground beneath him shift a little more as she took control of the conversation. All right, he said, struggling to keep up. What exactly would you like to discuss? For a moment, there was a silence, a calm pause that somehow felt more powerful than anything she could have said. It was as if she was giving him a chance to catch up, to realize just how wrong his assumptions had been. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and unwavering. I want to discuss my options for expanding my investments, she said, her gaze steady. And I expect to be treated with the same respect as any other client here. Her words were like a quiet demand, one that resonated in the room. She wasn't here to seek approval or validation. She was here to make decisions about her wealth, decisions that she was fully capable of understanding and handling. And she wasn't asking for his respect. She was expecting it, as a given right, not something he had to decide to offer. The banker's face reddened slightly. The authority in her tone was undeniable, and he could no longer ignore the clear message she was sending. She wasn't there to prove herself or seek his approval. She was there to make a business decision. It was a reminder that respect shouldn't be something he bestowed upon her because of her wealth. It should have been there from the start, regardless of how she looked or dressed. Suddenly, he felt a shift within himself, a strange mixture of shame and admiration. Shame for his initial judgments, for the way he'd looked at her and assumed she was unimportant. And admiration, not just for her wealth, but for the quiet dignity with which she had handled the entire encounter. She had never raised her voice, never responded with anger or frustration. She had simply held her ground, firm and unyielding, demanding respect without saying it outright. As she continued speaking, detailing her plans and goals, he listened more carefully than he had at any point that day. He took notes, nodded, and asked questions, no longer out of politeness but out of genuine interest and respect. He realized that this woman had far more insight than he'd assumed, that her experience and wisdom extended beyond the numbers on the paper in front of him. The tension between them began to fade, replaced by a newfound sense of respect, one he had been reluctant to give but was now freely offering. And all the while, she remained calm, unbothered by the change, as if she'd known all along that this was how it would end. The atmosphere in the room had changed. It was no longer just a simple meeting between a banker and a client. Something else was unfolding, something that drew quiet attention from others around them. Tension lingered in the air, like an unspoken force. Other bank staff and a few clients glanced over, sensing the unusual intensity of the moment. No one knew what was happening exactly, but they could feel the weight of it. The banker's face was a mix of emotions he couldn't quite hide. There was surprise, a touch of embarrassment, and somewhere in the back of his eyes, a growing respect he hadn't expected to feel. He was realizing, with each passing moment, just how wrong he'd been. Every assumption he'd made about this woman, every judgment based on her appearance, was slowly unraveling before him, and with it, his confidence was slipping, piece by piece, like sand falling through his fingers. Meanwhile, the woman stood firm, rooted in her quiet strength. She wasn't gloating or basking in her newfound power over him. She remained composed, almost serene, as though she had known all along that this moment would come. Her patience was unnerving, a silent assurance that demanded respect without a single word. She looked at him, her expression calm but direct, her eyes steady. "I'd like to continue with my investment plans as discussed," she said, her tone firm. "This is a priority for me." It was a simple statement, but the power behind it was unmistakable. She wasn't here to be brushed aside, to be treated as less than anyone else. She was making it clear, in her own subtle way, that she expected the same level of service and respect as any other high-profile client. And she was doing it with a quiet strength that spoke louder than any demand ever could. The banker swallowed, feeling a wave of humility wash over him. He had dealt with countless clients over the years, people who had vast wealth and influence, but rarely had he encountered someone who carried themselves with such dignity and poise. He felt a sting of regret for the way he had initially treated her, as though she were an inconvenience or a waste of his time. Now, looking at her, he understood just how blind he had been. He nodded, this time with genuine respect. "Of course, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady. "I apologize for any delay. I'll make sure we handle your investments with the utmost care." The woman gave a slight nod, acknowledging his words but not overly impressed by them. She had expected nothing less. To her, respect wasn't something that needed to be earned by proving wealth or status. It was a basic human courtesy, something that should have been there from the beginning. As the banker reviewed her investment documents, the silence between them grew thick with unspoken understanding. She didn't need to say anything more. Her presence alone was a reminder of his mistake, a quiet challenge to his assumptions. And though he could feel the eyes of others on him, watching, he didn't look up. This was a moment he would have to face alone, with only her silent dignity as his witness. But the woman wasn't finished. She spoke again, this time in a voice that was as calm as it was commanding. "I'd also like to discuss a few specific requests regarding my portfolio," she said, her tone leaving no room for dismissal. He nodded quickly, leaning forward, giving her his undivided attention. "Yes, of course. I'm here to listen to whatever you need." The banker's initial hesitation was gone. He was no longer acting out of politeness or obligation. Now he was genuinely engaged, eager to learn more about this woman who had shattered his preconceptions. With each detail she shared, each carefully thought-out decision, he realized that she was far more knowledgeable than he'd assumed. She had a deep understanding of her finances, a level of insight that matched or even surpassed that of many high-net-worth clients he'd worked with before. Meanwhile, those around them, bank employees and other clients alike, could sense the significance of what was happening. A few staff members had paused their work, casting glances in their direction, subtly observing the banker's shift in attitude. They, too, were beginning to understand the lesson unfolding in front of them. Here was a woman who had walked in quietly, without fanfare or expectation, and yet her presence demanded respect in a way that was undeniable. The banker felt the pressure of this attention, realizing that others were witnessing his change of heart, his awakening to the reality of his own biases. But this woman didn't seem fazed by any of it. Her gaze remained steady, focused on the matter at hand, as though nothing else in the room could distract her. She was there for her business, and she wasn't letting anything, not even his initial prejudice, stand in her way. As they continued their discussion, the banker found himself growing more and more intrigued by her. He realized that her investments weren't just numbers on a page to her. They were carefully planned, meaningful, tied to goals and values that she held dear. She wasn't merely accumulating wealth for the sake of it. She was building something with purpose. This realization struck him deeply. He saw that this woman wasn't just another client. She was someone with vision, someone who had worked hard, saved wisely, and invested thoughtfully. She was the embodiment of resilience, a woman who had likely faced countless challenges, but had never let them define her. And now, standing before him, she was a powerful reminder that wealth and worth aren't always visible on the surface. The banker's voice softened as he continued, his words now filled with a newfound respect. He listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and made notes with the kind of attentiveness he usually reserved for his wealthiest clients. But this time, it wasn't about the numbers. It was about acknowledging the strength, intelligence, and dignity of the person in front of him. Others in the bank could sense the shift, the quiet hum of admiration filling the room. This wasn't just a business transaction anymore. It was a moment of recognition, a subtle but profound acknowledgement of a truth that everyone there would carry with them long after the day ended. And through it all, the woman remained calm, her quiet strength holding the room in a way that left no doubt about who truly held the power in that interaction. She had walked in as just another client in simple clothes, and she was leaving as a figure of silent authority, a reminder to everyone there of the importance of humility, respect, and the courage to see beyond appearances. The banker could feel his pulse quickening as he reviewed her portfolio once more, his eyes scanning the details that he had initially overlooked. With every line, every figure, his initial assumptions were crumbling, replaced by a growing realization that he had gravely misjudged the woman standing before him. He thought he knew wealth when he saw it. He thought he could recognize power and importance by the look of a person. But here, in his own office, stood a woman who defied everything he thought he knew. His hand shook slightly as he set down her documents, trying to keep his expression neutral, though his mind was racing. This woman was not just a client. She was, in fact, one of the bank's most significant investors. Her account holdings were massive, the kind of numbers that would demand the utmost attention from even the most senior advisors in the bank. And she'd been a client here for years, quietly managing her wealth with a subtle, unwavering dignity that he had completely overlooked. He felt a pang of regret, an uncomfortable knot in his stomach, as he recalled his dismissive attitude only moments earlier. The look of surprise in his eyes did not go unnoticed by the woman, who watched him with a quiet, steady gaze. She didn't need to say a word. Her calm expression spoke volumes. There was a hint of knowing in her eyes, as if she had seen this reaction countless times before. It was a look that said she was used to being underestimated, used to being treated as though she were somehow less important. But today was different. Today, she was allowing him to see the truth. "Thank you for your patience," the banker finally said, his voice subdued, almost humbled. He was trying to gather his thoughts, searching for the right words to acknowledge the reality that had unfolded in front of him. It wasn't easy for him to admit that he'd been wrong, that he had let his own biases cloud his judgment. But there was no denying it now. He was in the presence of a woman whose wealth and influence far exceeded what he had originally assumed. The banker cleared his throat, feeling the weight of his own embarrassment. "I must admit, ma'am, that I wasn't aware of the extent of your investments with us," he said, choosing his words carefully. He glanced down, unable to meet her gaze, feeling the weight of his missteps pressing on him. He had treated her like an afterthought, someone he could brush off with polite indifference. But now he was realizing just how wrong he had been. The woman didn't smile. She didn't say anything to ease his discomfort. Instead, she simply nodded, her gaze calm and unwavering, as though she expected nothing less than honesty from him. She was not here for apologies or excuses. She was here as a client, an investor, someone with a vested interest in the bank's handling of her portfolio, and she was allowing him to come to terms with that reality on his own. For a moment, there was a heavy silence between them, a silence that carried the weight of everything left unsaid. The banker felt it, this unspoken reminder of his own error in judgment. He wanted to apologize, to offer some words that would convey his regret for the way he had treated her. But he knew that words would be meaningless in this moment. The only thing he could offer was respect, the respect she deserved from the start. As he looked back at her, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Here was a woman who had defied every stereotype, every shallow assumption he had made. She wasn't demanding respect. She was simply standing there, letting her quiet dignity and strength speak for themselves. She didn't need to prove anything, and that, he realized, was the real power she held. He glanced around the room, suddenly aware that others were watching, their curiosity piqued by the intensity of the interaction unfolding before them. Some of the younger bank employees looked on, their expressions a mix of surprise and intrigue. They, too, had likely misjudged this woman at first glance, and now they were witnessing the quiet but powerful revelation of her true importance. The banker could feel their eyes on him, as though they, too, were questioning his initial behavior, silently holding him accountable for the way he had treated her. The elderly woman looked at him, her gaze calm but knowing, as though she could see right through him. She didn't need to reprimand him or point out his mistake. She simply waited, giving him the space to come to terms with his own realization. And that, he thought, was perhaps the most humbling part of all. She was letting him feel the weight of his own mistake, letting him see for himself just how wrong he had been. With a newfound sense of respect, the banker cleared his throat once more, his voice now carrying a tone of genuine humility. "Ma'am, please know that I am here to assist you with anything you need," he said, his words no longer just polite phrases, but a sincere commitment. He wanted her to understand that he was ready to treat her with the respect she had earned, the respect he should have offered from the start. The woman nodded, acknowledging his words but offering no more than that. She didn't need his apology or his newfound admiration. She had already proven her worth simply by standing there, by allowing him to see the truth of her character and her strength. And in that moment, he understood that she had given him a gift, a lesson he would carry with him long after she left his office. As they resumed their discussion, the banker listened more closely than he ever had before. He asked questions, not just out of politeness, but out of genuine interest, eager to learn from someone whose wisdom and insight had clearly guided her to success. He could feel the shift within himself, a sense of humility that he hadn't felt in a long time, a realization that respect was not something to be granted based on appearances or assumptions, but something that should be given freely, as a matter of human dignity. Throughout the conversation, the woman remained calm and composed, never once acknowledging the shift in his attitude, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. She spoke confidently about her plans, her goals, each word a quiet testament to her strength and resilience. And as the banker listened, he found himself admiring her, not just for her wealth, but for the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. When their meeting finally ended, the banker stood, a sense of reverence filling him as he watched her gather her things. He realized that this woman had taught him more in a single meeting than he had learned in years of his career. She had reminded him of the importance of humility, of the need to look beyond appearances, and to recognize the strength and worth of every individual.